Hello there. My name is Gregory Carlson, and I'm a professional registered parliamentarian. I'd like to say special hello to all of the members of the Arizona State Association of Parliamentarians. I wish I could be there in person, but I hope you do enjoy this interactive presentation that I've made for you on the topic of interpreting ambiguous bylaws. Before we begin, I have to give my usual disclaimer that none of this presentation is legal advice, as I am not a lawyer, and as we will see, it is extremely important to read your own organization's bylaws before taking parliamentary advice. The way this is going to work is I'm going to walk you through the 8 principles of interpreting ambiguous bylaws set out in Robert's Rules of Order, and we'll then look at an example together, and then you'll have the time to look at an additional scenario with your President Joe Neglia. So I hope you're excited, and let's jump right in. Before we actually look at the 8 principles of interpreting bylaws, let's remind ourselves what bylaws actually are. Bylaws are the most important document governing your organization. It basically outlines what your organization is and how it operates. It contains all of the rules relating principally to itself as an organization. And the articles of the bylaws that Robert's Rules recommends include the name, the object of the organization, how to decide who is a member and who is not a member, how to elect officers and their duties, how meetings are to be scheduled and be operated. Sometimes there's an article on having an executive board or a board of directors. You'll also want an article on committees, including standing committees, an article outlining the parliamentary authority, and finally, and most importantly perhaps, an article outlining how the bylaws are to be amended. And the reason I say that is because most of the time, whenever you have a problem with your bylaws, the best way to fix that problem is to just amend the bylaws. Typically, the bylaws require for their amendment notice of the actual language of the amendment, and that notice has to be in the call for the meeting where the amendment is going to be considered. And furthermore, it typically takes a 2/3 vote at a meeting of those present and voting to adopt the amendment and make a change to the bylaws. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to assume that we don't have time to do that. In a perfect world, we'll just fix the bylaws with an amendment. But what happens if we don't have that amount of time? Typically, this might be because we don't have time to put it in the call, or maybe we're in the middle of a meeting and somebody just pointed out a flaw in the bylaws. That is what we are going to be focusing on in this presentation so that we can properly interpret the bylaws. And so let's go ahead and get started and look at the first principle of interpretation. The first principle of interpreting bylaws is that each society decides for itself the meaning of its bylaws. And this is important because the bylaws belong to the organization. If there truly is an ambiguous statement in the bylaws that's open to interpretation, then the matter is just decided by majority vote. Now we have to be careful here. The bylaws actually have to be open to interpretation. We can't just use this principle to do whatever we want. And I've heard the following before, and maybe you have too. I don't like what the bylaws say. Or the bylaws are really inconvenient. Or we'll just interpret the bylaws this way, this one time, just to get out of this sticky situation. In all of these cases, this is not a proper usage of the principle of interpreting these bylaws. There may be a majority of your organization that feels that the bylaws are inconvenient, but if the bylaws are clear, then you have to follow the bylaws, and you could get into trouble if you do not follow the bylaws. In any of these 3 cases, the proper thing to do is to offer an amendment to the bylaws so that they can be fixed through the proper way and for future meetings. But you can't just interpret around something that you don't like. They actually have to be open to interpretation. So with that in mind, let's actually look at an example that might be open to interpretation. Imagine your bylaws say the following. The president shall appoint the chairman of committees after the matter has been heard by the executive committee. Okay, seems straightforward enough. Let's look at 3 scenarios. Scenario A, the president proposes a chairman of a committee to the executive committee. They hear the person and they make a motion to approve the person. All of that's wonderful. All of that follows what the bylaws say, and I would argue that that vote to approve the person isn't even necessary because the bylaw simply says that there has to be a hearing by the executive committee. Okay, let's look at scenario B. In this scenario, the president appointed a chairman of a committee outside of a meeting on the president's own initiative. Well, this one you might get into trouble because the bylaws clearly say that there has to be a hearing by the executive committee, and so the president can't just appoint somebody out of the blue and tell them to get to work. So the proper thing to do here would be to raise a point of order at the next meeting. Now, the third scenario is a little bit tricky. Imagine that the president proposes a chair of a committee, the executive committee has a hearing, but then they adopt a motion to reject the candidate for the committee. What then? Well, we have to look back at what the bylaw says. The bylaw requires that the president shall appoint the chair of a committee after the matter has been heard by the executive committee. So you might see one side saying, well, we had the hearing, the president offered a proposal, and there was a hearing, and that's all that's required under the bylaw. You might then hear the opposing side say, well, that's not what the intent of the bylaw is. When the bylaws were first written, the intent was to give the executive committee a veto power to veto proposals by the president. And so you could see how that's a little bit more open to interpretation, and that you might have people with differing opinions on the matter. You might even hear them say, what's the point of having a hearing if the executive committee doesn't have that veto power? So this is where it might be open to interpretation, and you might decide the matter by majority vote. And the best thing to do would be to fix this bylaw as soon as possible. If you ask my opinion, I think that the person did meet all of the criteria outlined in the bylaws. The president offered a proposal, there was a hearing by the executive committee, and in my opinion, this bylaw is not powerful enough to give the executive committee the ability to veto somebody. Indeed, if we change the language slightly so that the executive committee was required to ratify the person, then it would be much more clear. So I hope you enjoyed that example of a bylaw that could be interpreted in two different ways. Here is another example for you to try on your own to interpret an ambiguous bylaw. The second principle of bylaw interpretation reads as follows. When a provision of the bylaws is susceptible to two meanings, one of which conflicts with or renders absurd another bylaw's provision, and the other meaning does not, then the latter must be taken as the true meaning. Here's what that means. When you're reading some bylaws, one of the things I like to do is, reading through the bylaws, I like to look for sentences that are falsifiable, meaning a sentence that is either true or false when it's presented with a conflicting sentence. And the reason for that is because those sentences are like anchors for me. Sentences that are very clear and straightforward and can be seen to be either true or false can help you when it runs up against sentences that are open to interpretation. So I know that's a little confusing, so let's look at an example. Imagine the bylaws read the following. Under Board of Directors, the Board of Directors shall be the 4 officers and 5 other members. Okay? Then imagine later on, in a different article on committees, the bylaws say that the 3 committee chairs shall serve as additional members to the Board of Directors. Okay, well now the question is, how many members does the board have? And because if we look at the first sentence, the Board of Directors shall be the 4 officers and 5 other members, the answer is 9. But if you look at the second sentence, the 3 committee chairs shall serve as additional members to the Board of Directors, then the answer is 12. So which is it, 9 or 12? What do you think? Well, it's quite clear that the problematic word is this word additional. This additional members is the word that is a little bit tricky, because how does that fit into the rest of the bylaws? But let's remember the principle. Does this second sentence render absurd the first sentence? I would argue that it does, because read the first sentence again. The Board of Directors shall be the 4 officers and 5 other members. That's a falsifiable statement. That means that the Board of Directors has 9 members, and that's either true or false. It's either going to have 9 or some other number that's different than 9. So in my opinion, the second sentence, these 3 additional members must fall under those 5 other members that are listed in the first sentence. And so in my opinion, the answer to this question is that the Board of Directors has 9 members, because that first sentence is so clear. The Board of Directors shall be the 4 officers and 5 other members. If we to interpret the second sentence in its entirety, then that would render absurd the first sentence, which says that there's 9 members, and now all of a sudden there's 12 members. As usual, this bylaw should be fixed so that it's more clear who serves on the Board of Directors, but hopefully you can see how Principle 2 can be applied. Why don't you look at an example for yourself to give yourself a chance? The third principle of bylaw interpretation is that a general statement or rule is always of less authority than a specific statement or rule, and it yields to it. This is a really helpful principle because it makes writing bylaws a little bit easier. You can write general rules that will govern in most cases, and then when you need to, you can write a more specific rule for those one-time situations where you need to give somebody some special privilege or create an exception to something. So again, if you have a general rule, that will always yield to a more specific rule on the same topic. So let's look at an example. Imagine the bylaw said the following. All officers shall be members of the Finance Committee. The President shall be a member of the Communications and the Bylaws Committee. Fair enough. Later on, it says no member shall be a member of more than 2 committees. And so let's imagine you're at a meeting and somebody raises a point of order that the President is on too many committees in violation of the bylaws, because the bylaws clearly say that no member shall be a member of more than 2 committees. So how should the President rule on this point of order? What do you think? Well, let's apply the principle. Remember that specific rules take precedence over more general rules. Which one is the general rule here? The general rule is that no member shall be a member of more than 2 committees. That's a more general rule because it's talking about all of the members. Now we can see that there's a specific exception for the President. First, it says that all officers shall be members of the Finance Committee, and then in addition, the President shall be a member of the Communications and the Bylaws Committee. And so the President is allowed to serve on these 3 committees because those are specific exceptions that are outlined for the President as an officer that would take precedence over the rule about serving on more than 2 committees. However, to extend the example, do you think the President would be allowed to serve on any more committees than the ones outlined in the bylaws? In that case, I think the answer would be no, because then the rule about not serving on more than 2 committees would go ahead and kick in. It's clear that the President's duties are outlined in the bylaws, and these are more specific than the general rule about no member serving on more than 2 committees, and so the President is allowed to be a member of these 3 committees. So now that you've seen the principle that a specific rule will take more precedence than a general rule, and that the general rule will yield to it, why don't you try this example on your own? The fourth principle of bylaws interpretation reads as follows. If the bylaws authorize certain things specifically, then other things of the same class are thereby prohibited. The way I like to think of this principle is that if the bylaws are being generous, and if they're being generous about something specific, as the principle says, then other things of that same class are not allowed. You can think of the bylaws as having a cap on its generosity, and that you cannot exceed that cap when you're doing something. So let's look at an example. Imagine the bylaws say that the standing committees shall be a budget committee, bylaws committee, and a communications committee. Then imagine during a meeting, a member stands up and says, I move to create a permanent social events committee. Is that allowed? No, it is not allowed, not under this bylaw. And the reason is because the bylaws have spelt out which standing committees are allowed. And it's pretty specific. It shall be a budget, bylaws, and communications committee. And therefore, a member is not allowed to create a new permanent standing committee just with a motion. Also, be sure to read Section 50, Paragraph 9 in Robert's Rules 12th edition in connection with this. So what could the member do? Well, assuming that the bylaws don't have any rules on special committees, the motion could be fixed and the chair could offer that the member create a special committee or a temporary committee to handle social events. And that would then be allowed. But it would not be a permanent committee because the permanent committees are the standing committees which are outlined in the bylaws. So as you can see, the bylaws can be generous, but they do put a cap on their generosity. See if you can apply principle number 4 to the following scenario. The fifth principle of bylaw interpretation is similar to the fourth principle. Let's see what it says. A provision granting certain privileges carries with it a right to a part of the privilege, but prohibits a greater privilege. So as you can see, that's similar to principle number 4. If the bylaws authorize the power to do certain things, you can certainly do part of those things, but you're not able to exercise more power than what the bylaws allow. So let's look at an example. Imagine your bylaws say the following. The meetings will be on the first Monday of the month at headquarters. And then later on in the bylaws, it says that the president may set the time of the meeting. All right, let's look at the scenario. The president sends out an email stating that this month's meeting is going to be moved to Wednesday at 5 p.m. and that we will meet at a restaurant. So the question is this a legal meeting? And the answer is no, it would not be a legal meeting. And so let's apply the principle to see why. We can see that the bylaws do authorize the president to set the time for the meeting. However, notice that not only the date, but also the location are prescribed in the bylaws, and the president does not have the power to change that part. So you can see that this meeting would not be proper. The president can certainly set the time of the meeting, but the location and date are set in stone. And the reason these rules exist in the first place is so that members can be confident they will know when the meeting is going to be, and so that nobody can play games with where the meeting is going to be. It increases the chances that all the members know when and where the meeting are going to be so that they can participate. So hopefully you now understand principle number 5. See if you can apply it to the following scenario. The 6th principle of bylaws interpretation reads as follows. A prohibition or limitation prohibits everything greater than what is prohibited, or that goes beyond the limitation, but it permits what is less than the limitation, and it also permits things of the same class that are not mentioned in the prohibition or limitation, and they're not evidently improper. All right, that's a lot of words, but it's basically the flip side of the 2 principles we just looked at. What it's saying is that if the bylaws have put a limit or a prohibition on something, you're free to operate within that limit, but you cannot exceed what is prohibited. And you can also do things within the prohibition that are not evidently improper if they're not mentioned in the bylaws. So let's look at an example. Imagine your bylaws say the following. A member may hold office for up to 3 consecutive terms and may only hold 1 office. All right, let's look at 3 scenarios. The president wants to run for a 4th term. Well, clearly that's not allowed. Clearly that is beyond the limitation that is set in the bylaws, which say that you may only run for up to 3, you may only hold office for 3 consecutive terms. So that president is out of luck on serving a 4th term. How about the next scenario? A member is elected to secretary and treasurer in the officer election. Perhaps all of the officers were on the same ballots and one person got elected secretary and treasurer. Is that allowed? The answer is no, because applying the principle, once again, the bylaws say that a person may only hold 1 office, and so that person would have to choose which office that they're going to serve in. So far, so good. Let's look at scenario number 3. A member who has served 3 terms as secretary was just elected the vice president. Is that allowed? Well, that one's a little bit trickier because let's read the bylaws. It says a member may hold office for up to 3 consecutive terms and may only hold 1 office. That one is a little bit more open to interpretation because you can see that they've gone from one position as 3 terms and has now gone on to a new term. I would argue that this is still a violation because read the bylaws carefully. It says a member may hold office for up to 3 consecutive terms. Office. They may hold office. Notice it doesn't say they may hold the same office. They may hold office for 3 consecutive terms. So in my opinion, even this person has now exceeded the limitation that was placed in the bylaws. However, I could definitely see that one being potentially argued because typically what is the case is that you may not hold office consecutively in the same office. And indeed, if the bylaws said that, the matter would be different. But in my opinion, even this 3rd person has exceeded the limitation that is put on the same people holding office for consecutive terms. Hopefully that principle makes sense. See if you can apply it to the following scenario. The 7th principle of bylaw interpretation talks about imposing penalties on members. So let's see what it says. The imposition of a definite penalty for a particular action prohibits the increase or diminution of the penalty. So what that means is if the bylaws spell out that if a member does X and the penalty is Y, then you cannot increase the penalty or decrease the penalty. And the reason for that is basic fairness. If two members have done the same action, then if the rule is clear, it would be unfair if one member had to face the penalty and the other member did not have to face the penalty. So let's look at an example. Imagine your bylaws say the following. A member shall be removed from membership if they miss 3 consecutive meetings and have received a letter after the second absence warning them. So pretty straightforward. We want our members to come to meetings. So let's look at some scenarios. Member A has missed 2 consecutive meetings. Should they be removed? Well, we look back at the bylaw and we see that the answer is no, because the bylaw requires you to miss 3 consecutive meetings. And so member A is okay right now, and it would be improper to remove them or to try to remove them. How about member B? Member B has missed 3 consecutive meetings, but they did not receive the letter. Well, that one is a little bit trickier. However, I would argue that it is improper to remove this member. The reason is because they did not complete the prerequisite that the bylaws requires in order to remove them from membership. They have to miss 3 consecutive meetings, and after the second meeting, they have to receive a warning letter in order for the entire bylaw to be complied with. By the way, this is why if you're in charge of sending out those letters, you'll want to do it with some kind of registered mail to prove that the letter went out. And so that would be an important practice to do in the organization. But for now, I would argue that member B is safe because although they missed 3 consecutive meetings, they didn't receive their letter. Perhaps the letter wasn't sent out, and so therefore the bylaw has not been fully complied with. If they then send out a letter warning them and then they miss another meeting, at that point they could probably be removed. How about member C? Member C missed 3 consecutive meetings and did receive the warning letter. Well, in this case, member C would be removed from membership. And that's because they missed 3 consecutive meetings and they did receive the letter, and so therefore they shall be removed from membership. But let's imagine that this is a really important member of the society. Maybe it's a big donor of the society or somebody who's been involved for a very, very long time. What should we do about that situation? Can the society adopt a motion to keep them? Maybe even a motion to suspend the rules to allow them to stay a member by a 2/3 vote? Well, looking back at the principle, the answer is no. You cannot increase or decrease the penalty if it is spelt out in the bylaws. And so unfortunately, that member would be out of luck. However, certainly nothing would prohibit them from rejoining the society and following the process to become a member again. But they would have to be removed, but that would not necessarily prohibit them from applying for membership again in the future. So, bottom line is, Principle 7 says you need to follow through with whatever penalties are in the bylaws if they're applicable. See if you can apply that principle to the following scenario. We finally arrived to the 8th principle of bylaws interpretation, and it's what I like to call the trickle-down effect. Let's take a look. In cases where the bylaws use a general term and also 2 or more specific terms that are wholly included under the general one, a rule in which only the general term is used also applies to the specific terms. So if you have a general category of something, and within that category there are outlined some specific subcategories, and maybe those different subcategories have their own rules, well, any rule that applies to the general category will trickle down to all of the specific categories as well. And so let's see an example of how that might be applied. Imagine your bylaws say the following. They say there shall be 3 elected officers and the president shall appoint 4 appointed officers. All right. Then later the bylaws say the board of directors shall include all officers. The question is, how many members does the board have? So that's the question. What do you think the answer is? Let's apply the principle. We can see that we have a general statement. The board of directors shall include all officers. And for officers, we have 2 specific kinds of officers. We have elected officers and we have appointed officers. And so the way the principle number 8 applies is that if there's something that's said about the general term, then it applies to all of the specific terms. So when it says the board of directors shall include all officers, that would include anything that's an officer. And so it would include the 3 elected officers, and it would include the 4 appointed officers. And so therefore there would be 7 members of the board of directors. Thank you so much for coming with me on this journey through the 8 principles of interpreting bylaws. As you can see, it can be very challenging sometimes to interpret bylaws, but I hope this has given you some tools to help you in the future when you are faced with contradictory bylaws. Again, my name was Gregory Carlson, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Let's finish off with applying this last principle, and I'll include my contact information if you would like to contact me in the future. Thank you again for joining me on this, and I look forward to meeting you. Have a great day.